Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our webinar on the DOL's proposed overtime regulations. My name is Laura Jordan. I'm a partner in the Human Resources Practice Group. Myself and several attorneys at Thompson Coburn handle numerous types of wage and hour matters, and we have been waiting for these proposed regulations for quite some time, so I'm excited to talk to you about this today. I wish I could have picked a cheekier title for today's session. If I did, it would probably be, we've got more questions than answers. Because at this time, of course, we're talking about proposed regulations and not final rules. We have found ourselves with a lot of open-ended issues. And for many of our clients, the open-ended issues are more frightening than what we know of right now within the text of the proposed rule changes. We're going to do four things today. First, we are going to go through a little bit of a background to understand the basis for the proposed rule changes. Second, we will, of course, get into the details of what the proposed regulations provide. Third, we'll spend some time talking about what the DOL did not do, but about which the DOL has solicited feedback. We think that this will be serves as a strong predictor of the next wave of proposed rule changes. And finally, we will discuss considerations that to make while we are waiting for the rules to be finalized. And of course, we'll have time at the end for questions, as we talked about earlier. So how did we get here? Probably the most important event to take us back to would be in March of 2014, when President Obama and the Secretary of Labor held separate press conferences during which they discussed changes that they wanted to make to the DOL's current regulations. The command from President Obama was as follows. He commanded the DOL to, quote, modernize and streamline the existing overtime regulations, and in doing so, the DOL shall consider how the regulations could be revised to update existing protections consistent with the intent of the Act, address the changing nature of the workplace, and simplify the regulations to make them easier for both workers and businesses to understand and apply. There is some truth to the argument that the regulations have become outdated. The Department of Labor has been historically quite slow in updating its regulations, and some might say delinquent in keeping the salary thresholds current. Consider this. In 1975, the minimum salary threshold for a white-collar worker exemption was $250 a week, which was about $13,000 a year. It remained at $250 a week for 29 years, including during periods of extreme economic growth. It wasn't until 2004 that the Department of Labor under the Bush administration overhauled regulations that had been virtually untouched for about 50 years. And during that overhaul, the DOL eliminated the long and short test dichotomy, increased the minimum salary to $455 a work week, and added some new exemptions. Since President Obama became elected, he has stated repeatedly that his regulatory agenda included prioritization of increasing salary thresholds for the exemptions. The healthcare reform and Middle East conflicts seem to have consumed the prioritization list. So it wasn't until that March 2014 press conference where this became an active initiative. The proposed rules we're going to talk about today have been actively in process for 16 months. Ironically, though, they changed far less than they had promised. The proposed regulatory changes were released on June 30th of 2015, and they were published in the Federal Register on July 6th of 2015. The notice and comment period actually was just set and will end on September 4th of 2015. According to the Department of Labor, it will easily be 2016 before the rules are final. Some commentators have projected that due to the anticipated volume of comments that are going to be submitted, it will be probably a year before they are complete. As of yesterday, the day after the proposed rules were published, there were 33 comments submitted. This morning, there were already 86 comments submitted. Given that pace, I don't think that a year is completely unrealistic. So let's dig into the actual proposed regulations. The articulated objective of the Department of Labor with these revisions were, number one, to increase the minimum salary threshold to be considered exempt, two, to simplify the identification of non-exempt employees, and three, create some mechanism to automatically update the minimum salaries to avoid the backlogs created by rulemaking and political gridlock. Despite those three objectives, in a nutshell, the proposed regulations only create an automatic adjustment to the minimum salary requirements, and even the numbers proposed in the regulation by the DOL's admission are placeholders which will be obsolete by the time the rules are finalized. And despite the President's command to simplify the exemption analysis, that clearly has not happened with these proposed regulations. As you may recall, to be exempt, in addition to meeting a minimum salary requirement, all employees must pass a duties test under one of the exemptions. The duties test was not touched in these set of proposed rule changes. And frankly, meeting the duties test tends to be the most complicated part of the exemption analysis. That said, there is some suggestion in the commentary to the proposed rules that with the increase in the base salary, the DOL expects that the exemption disputes will decrease. The DOL wrote that the proposed increase to the standard salary level is intended to address the department's conclusion that the salary level set in 2004 was too low to effectively screen out from the exemption overtime protected white-collar employees when paired with a standards duties test. In other words, they believe that if you increase the minimum salary enough, everybody who meets the minimum salary would otherwise be exempt. We have seen the DOL and the courts repeatedly question whether employees earning that minimum salary over time could do anything that would be of sufficient significance to actually be exempt level duties. And on the flip side, we saw recently the Supreme Court articulate in the Christopher versus Smith-Kline case that workers earning over $70,000 a year were, quote, hardly the type of workers the FLSA was intended to be concerned over. So there is some truth to what we see in the law about how salary is considered to be commensurate with the duties. Despite this, we do see some strong indicators in the commentary that the DOL is planning to overhaul the duties tests in a separate batch of rule changes, which we'll discuss a little bit later. So let's talk first about the executive, administrative, and professional exemptions. As you may recall, under the Fair Labor Standards Act, there are multiple exemptions under which you can rely to avoid overtime pay for certain employees. The executive, administrative, and professional exemptions are the most heavily used. Each of these have their own separate duties tests that have to be met in addition to being paid the minimum salary. Again, with no changes to the duties test, the only change to the executive, administrative, and professional exemptions proposed is an increase to the minimum salary to be considered for these exemptions. The written proposed rules increase the base salary from $455 per week to $921 per week. The $920 a week appears to be an intended floor for all prospective changes to the minimum salary levels. The $921 per week level was set based on 2013 Bureau of Labor Statistics data. The data used from the BLS was a survey of full-time salaried employees. And although the 2013 numbers are already obsolete, the DOL says that that will be the lowest number that will intended to be used. Prospectively, the minimum salary would be adjusted to the 40th percentile of weekly earnings for those full-time salaried workers. Had the DOL used the Q1 2015 numbers, that 40th percentile number would have been $951 per work week, which is just shy of $50,000 a year. The DOL says that by the time these rules are finalized, they think that they will have the Q1 2016 numbers in hand, and assuming a 2% growth rate, that new number would be $970 per week. This 40th percentile number is a major departure from the DOL's prior methodology. Until this proposal, the highest percentile previously applied was 20th percentile, and at times in the past history, the DOL used numbers as low as the 10th percentile of salary workers. The DOL's rationale for moving up to 40th percentile is that because we eliminated in 2004 the short and long tests, the salary needs to increase to effectively screen out obviously non-exempt workers. In articulating this rationale, the DOL made what I thought was a rather shocking conclusion. They claim that as of today, 85% of white-collar workers who pass the salary test could not pass the duties test for any of the classifications. As a result, they believe that these rule changes are necessary to clean out some very obviously non-exempt workers. If you recall, in addition to those executive, administrative, and professional exemptions, we have the highly compensated exemption. Under the current highly compensated exemption, if a worker earns in total of non-discretionary pay in a year over $100,000 or more, then and they perform white-collar duties, at least one of those duties, which would be an exempt level duty, then they are presumptively exempt. Under the proposed regulations, the minimum salary would be increased to the 90th percentile of that same salary survey that would be used, which today would be $122,000, 148. As with the prior proposed exemption changes, that will be adjusted annually, commensurate with the other changes. Now, although the title of the regulatory changes says that changes are also being made to the computer employee exemption, the only change made to the computer employee exemption would be that same minimum salary threshold. Under the current computer employee exemption, as you may recall, computer employees can be exempt either if they're paid on that minimum salary basis, or they can be paid on an hourly basis of at least $27.63 an hour, while still being exempt. Interestingly, while the salary basis is increasing in the proposed rule changes to the computer employee exemption, the minimum hourly rate was not touched. Anticipating that we would all wonder why, the DOL said they didn't touch the $27.63 an hour threshold because they weren't asked to. So we're not going to see any changes to that minimum hourly rate. The DOL, however, did say that they anticipated providing later on further clarity about the types of work that do and do not fall within this computer employee exemption. There's been a noticeable lack of clarity as the IT industry has evolved about who would and wouldn't be covered by this exemption. So it appears that they expect to provide additional guidance in the future. Clearly, the most complicated aspect of the proposed regulations will be how to plan in the future where the regulatory framework provides for automatic adjustments to the minimum salary threshold, particularly when we really don't even know what that number will be once it's finalized. For some reference, this index salary threshold is not a new concept. Prior to 1975, the indexing was a general guideline of how the DOL set the salary threshold. And before 1975, it was changing about every 5 to 9 years. The salary indexing was abandoned in 1975, and it was revisited when the DOL overhauled the regs in 2004. During that 2004 overhaul, the DOL said they didn't need to index the salaries because they intended to update the minimum salary threshold more frequently than they had been in the past, which had been 29 years prior to 2004. Alas, that hasn't happened, and the DOL has said that because of political gridlock and rulemaking, they want to have some automatic mechanism to avoid this regulatory process in the future. There are two proposed methodologies for calculating this minimum salary threshold in the future. The first, which seems to be clearly the DOL's preference, would be to apply the 40th percentile method based on the Bureau of Labor Statistics calculation of average weekly wages for all full-time salaried employees. Now, this BLS survey is the nationwide current population survey of full-time salaried employees. It encompasses both exempt and non-exempt salaried workers. And the way it works is that they survey 60,000 households a month. They survey them for 4 months on, 8 months off, 4 months on, and 8 months off, and they rotate among households. This is the same survey that was used to set the $455 work week threshold in 2004, with a notable exception. In 2004, when they used the survey, they made adjustments to exclude people who were obviously non-exempt or not potentially covered by the regulations, such as self-employed workers, teachers, judges, agricultural workers. Now, under the proposed use of the survey, everyone would be included in the proposed pool, and there will be no geographic adjustments or adjustments for lower income areas or industries. The second proposed methodology would be to use the Consumer Price Index, which essentially is an adjustment for inflation. The DOL gives a nod to using the Consumer Price Index because that's what the IRS uses to adjust tax brackets. A lot of companies rely on the Consumer Price Index, but in any event, the DOL provides a lot of calculations, and they think that these ultimately will kind of land the same over time. Under their projections, the BLS method will cost less upfront but more down the road. The Consumer Price Index would cost more upfront and slightly less down the road. If I was a gambler, which I am not, I'd probably put my money on the use of the Bureau of Labor Statistics surveys over the Consumer Price Index method. The DOL indicates that if they use the CPI, the minimum salary, once the regs are finalized, would be over $1,000 per week from the start. And I think that they can see that that's not going to get very far in the rulemaking process. Now, if this indexing goes forward as requested, the DOL would publish the updated salaries in the Federal Register with 60 days notice upon each increase. And right now, the DOL claims to have made no commitment on either the BLS or the Consumer Price Index method, and are waiting for you all to chime in so that they can pick which route to take. Probably what is more interesting is what the Department of Labor did not do but wants to get some feedback about. The packet of proposed rules contain 9 pages of changed regulations and 287 pages of explanation about what they did and why and what they want you to think about going forward. The solicitation from the DOL of comments and feedback contains multiple things, a long laundry list of things that they are thinking about, and almost all of it pertains to changes that they want to make to the duties tests. The solicitation suggests that a second wave of proposed rules would be imminent, and given the status of the executive branch and the election, I don't think it's unreasonable to think that sometime next spring we would see those changes. As we'll talk about with the solicited feedback, there are a few things that the DOL is proposing that look like concessions for employers, but most of them seem to be an even further tightening of the application of the exemptions. So let's talk about first the first proposed or considered concession for employers. The most notable would be that the DOL is soliciting feedback about providing allowances of non-discretionary bonuses to offset the salaried obligations for the salary basis test. Currently under the regulations, non-discretionary bonuses, and I'm talking about formulaic bonuses based on objective measures, have to be counted in what an employee's regular rate of pay is to determine your overtime liability. So if an employee gets a production bonus or something of that kind, it gets factored into regular rate of pay for their time and a half calculation. But that same non-discretionary bonus cannot be used in calculating what an employee gets paid if they are trying to meet the salary basis test to be exempt at $455 a work week. There's one exemption that uses those non-discretionary bonuses, and that's the highly compensated exemption. And we get to use the non-discretionary bonuses for highly compensated exemptions because that $100,000 rule is based on an annualized non-discretionary pay. So under the regs, you can make a, for example, catch-up non-discretionary year-end bonus to keep an employee over that $100,000 threshold. So under what the DOL has said in their request for feedback is that they're thinking about allowing employers to account for some of that non-discretionary pay as a credit toward the achievement of that required minimum salary in the salary basis test. They said that they are recognizing the increased importance of bonus and incentive compensation in white-collar positions in the United States today, and that they're open to allowing those payments towards the minimum base salary. However, they have said that if they make these changes, they would limit the application of that bonus offset, and what they put out there was a 10% cap. And if we do get to use those non-discretionary bonuses, they'd have to be paid with some frequency so that it looks more like part of their regular salary. And they basically said that means it's not going to be an annual bonus that we get to use. Now again, the proposed rule changes today contain no changes of any kind to the duties test. But with embedded in all the commentary that the DOL provided are repeated questions about how and whether we should change the duties tests. In fact, they spent more time in the commentary talking about changing the duties test than they did talking about what they actually did change in the salary basis test. I'm not going to read all of the questions that are asked, but there were 5 specific questions, enumerated questions, asked by the Department of Labor that they want us to consider. If my memory serves me well, I believe that the President answered every one of these questions in one or more of his press conferences about whether the duties test should be changed. None of the questions that we see here are surprising. They've been, frankly, something that the Secretary of Labor and the President have repeatedly discussed. And in particular, what we know is that the administration has repeatedly expressed concern about the working supervisors. These are people, think of your fast food shift supervisors and retail managers who spend most of their time working side by side doing rote non-management work, but a small part of their day is spent doing supervisory work like approving timesheets, delivering write-ups that are prepared by human resources or upper management. But when you look at their day overall, they are not really exercising their independent judgment and discretion, and the supervising that they're doing seems to be more like communicating decisions made by somebody else. We expect that because of the mandate provided by the President in the past that there will be some limitation to the, in particular, the executive exemption and likely the administrative exemption about what really it means to be exercising independent judgment and discretion in matters of importance. Perhaps the best lean into that would be the third question that the Department of Labor put out there, which is, should we look to the state of California's model? And in that model, for example, for the executive exemption, the employee has to be spending at least 50% of the employee's day actually supervising. And for a lot of organizations, and many of whom are probably on this call, who operate lean management practices, there would be very few people who would meet that that California test in a lot of companies. In addition, what we see from the solicited feedback is what seems to be a deep affection in today's Department of Labor for the old long and short duties tests that were eliminated in the 2004 regulatory overhaul. The commentary seems to lay blame on the chronic underpayment of salaried workers today on the removal of those long and short tests. And it seems to be that they would like to consider bringing those back. And if you remember how the long test and short test worked, if an employee made enough money, a higher end on that salary threshold, there was a short list of questions that were easier to pass. And if they earned less money, there was a more stringent duties test that was more complicated and harder to prove to be exempt. It would be quite ironic if the outcome of this process would be a return of the long and short test, given that the mandate from the President was to simplify the exemption process. Only time will tell what happens with these duties tests, but based on the questions, the solicited feedback, and the identified questions in which they really want you to answer, it seems that changes to the duties test are imminent. Now, perhaps the most important reason why we wanted to talk with all of you today is recognizing that these rules are only proposed is how we plan during the wait. Many of you who have gone through some reclassification process know that reclassification can be cumbersome, it can be time-consuming, and it can be disruptive. And the timing of these regulations is not good because a lot of our clients are already undertaking 2016 budgeting now. So all we can really tell you is that the minimum salary thresholds will increase. We know that they are intended to be increasing by quite a lot, but we don't know how much and we don't know when. It does not seem like we're going to be seeing any increase in calendar year 2015, but that's about as far as we can get with clarity. But we do know that whatever number we end up with as a minimum salary, some employees will have to be reclassified. And if there are ultimate changes to the duties tests, there may be quite a lot more employees that have to be reclassified into 2016 and perhaps even 2017. So we wanted to spend a little bit of time with you today talking about how to plan for that. The first thing we should talk about is whether you provide comments during this notice and comment period. For some of you on this call, these changes that are proposed are going to have a more significant impact for your organization than perhaps others that, for example, a professional services firm where that $50,000 threshold is probably covering most of your exempt workers already. But for some companies, such as those who have workers in remote, lower income or lower market areas, the new minimum salary thresholds are going to be less tolerable than those in higher income areas. In addition, these proposed changes may substantially impair the budgets and operations of social service employers and not-for-profits who rely on the exemption status and don't have the budgetary flexibility to deal with overtime pay. If that is the case, we recommend that you consider tendering comments during this notice and comment period. Remember that submitted comments are not private. They are subject to review, and if you're uncomfortable with providing comments on behalf of your organization directly, the best resource would be through a trade group or the Society of Human Resources Management, because they would submit collective comments. We know for sure that the employee rights organizations and unions are going to be submitting feedback, and obviously the concern always is that there is not a balanced pool of information being provided to the Department of Labor as a matter of public record. But for your organization directly, really now is the time for you to get a handle on what your employees are doing. Whether or not there are any changes made to the duties test today or even within the next year, every exemption requires you as an employer to be able to prove that your employees are performing exempt level duties. And what happens when we have regulatory changes is that they tend to wake up employees and plaintiffs' lawyers, and we see claims kind of getting sparked during this conversation. In addition, you're likely to get questions from your employees about whether they are exempt, whether they should be reclassified, when they should be reclassified, why somebody else is getting overtime now and they are not, or vice versa. And so I think probably the most important thing to do right now is to devote your time during this waiting period to make sure that your job descriptions are current and accurate and complete. Consider collecting updated duties and information about what each individual employee is doing. And frankly, because we're approaching Q4, where a lot of companies are doing their comp reviews and performance appraisals, I'm a big fan of self-evaluations during a review and raise time to be used for verifying the duties tests. Some of you who have gone through misclassification cases or have gone through self-audits know that whether an employee is exempt or non-exempt is a person-by-person determination. A job description alone or a job title is not dispositive about whether an employee is exempt. So in other words, the employee is the best source of information about whether they are performing duties that are exempt or not. There are two situations you can have. If an employee is disputing with you about whether they're exempt, they're likely to understate the level of significance of their work. They're going to understate the importance of their work, and they will understate the level of discretion that they apply in their work. The time that an employee is most likely to be comprehensive and about what they are doing and probably tell you how important their work is when they're up for a raise or a review. So with adequate planning, a self-evaluation where an employee gives a full account of their duties, how much time they're spending in each of their duties, how and whether they exercise independent judgment and discretion, can be an extremely helpful tool for you in making classification determinations, because frankly, the salary part of it is rather simple and involves a payroll register. The hard part is looking at the duties test. Third, now is the time to really start thinking about a communication strategy. There is no one-size-fits-all system, but it is a good idea to have someone or preferably a designated team inside your organization to kind of own the process, stay current on what's happening with the rules, know what information is needed from your organization and who to get it from, and how to time it. You're going to need somebody inside your organization for budget planning purposes and projections, and because we have a moving target in what these minimum salaries are, it would be helpful for someone inside your organization to be that point person. And ultimately, you're going to need someone to coordinate how to communicate with your workers if they are moved in classification. There are some people who are happy about being reclassified to hourly and overtime eligible, but there, in my experience, is an equal number of employees who are unhappy with the prospect of being moved to hourly and consider it to be a demotion. And there are multiple alternative ways to deal with that as you move on in the future. I think the hardest question that our employers have to deal with right now is whether and when to do cleanup reclassifications. We've seen from the commentary and in our own experience that there are a lot of companies who have recently identified employees who are misclassified, either because their jobs have changed and become less discretionary, because an employee's performance has lagged and their duties have been taken away, the types of duties that made them exempt have been taken away, or the industry has changed and automated. The challenge, of course, of reclassifying employees from salaried exempt to some non-exempt status is, without an excuse to do so, that reclassification can create some legal admission that the employee was previously misclassified, which could expose your organization to overtime liability for up to 3 years prior to when that reclassification occurs. We had hoped that the changes to the regulations would include enough changes to the duties test that we could reclassify workers that we already knew weren't exempt, and have this moment of time where we could say, you know, maybe we had an argument that you were exempt in early 2014, but we've got these new rules, and so we're just going to go with it, and you're going to get reclassified because we have to under the new rules. And we would have some argument that in the past that you would have met those duties tests, or at least we could have defended it without any legal admission. We've got no changes to the duties test today. So it's hard for us to have that conversation with an employee of, hey, your duties used to pass and they don't pass. And so I think it's a harder question than we anticipated to decide whether to do cleanup reclassifications. But I do think that for some of you, this still may be as good of a time as ever. There's a couple of reasons. First, the media coverage has been quite vague about this. Most people who are watching the nightly news or skimming through the news on social media or on the internet are just going to hear that there are some changes coming to the overtime rules and more people are going to be overtime eligible. There aren't a lot of people who are getting to the point of what we're talking about today who know what those changes really are. In addition, there are going to be co-workers that are going to be reclassified at the same time. So it isn't a bad time to do an overhaul because we can just take the position, we've got to do some reclassifications, you're just going to be one of the people we have to reclassify, and now you're getting paid overtime and you're going to have to track your hours. In any event, any of the reclassifications are going to require a strong communication plan. There are some options that you can consider to minimize the disruption. For example, you can transition employees from salaried exempt to salaried non-exempt, where they're still paid on a minimum salary basis, and the only change is that they report their overtime hours and get paid for those overtime hours. That obviously costs more than moving somebody straight hourly, where they're not paid when they're not working and they're paid overtime if they're working overtime. But for some of those lower hour required positions, salaried non-exempt can be an option. In addition, sometimes what we've found is that in this reclassification process, our compensation plans what ends up happening is some of the subordinate employees who start getting overtime start earning more money than their supervisors, which can be a problem. There is an allowance under the regulations to give exempt level workers, such as supervisors, overtime premiums under certain circumstances that don't blow their exemption status. So that, again, is a more expensive option, but is something you can consider to avoid some of the pain or trauma or disruption that occurs with the reclassification. But the reason why we're spending so much time talking about this part of it is that it's important to be nimble. Once these rules are finalized, we're only going to have 60 days before they become effective. And 60 days is not enough for any organization of any size to implement a reclassification system. The 5 to 12 months available to us right now, while the rules are pending and yet to be final, are going to probably go by like a blink. And so we would recommend, number one, to start collecting information about what the employee's duties are now and ensure that it is current. Now, the Department of Labor has set up a page for information and updates on the rule changes. It's quite a fancy website, I might say. It appears that they spent most of the last 16 months building a website that outperformed the healthcare.gov than they did actually on working on the changes to the regulation, since there are relatively few. But on the link provided on this slide, there is you can find a full text of the proposed rules, along with the full text of their commentary about the changes and the solicited feedback, which is as much of a lesson in economics as it is in anything else. In addition, if you wish to submit comments or feedback to the proposed rules, you can go to regulations.gov, and they allow for comments to be submitted electronically. Okay, we have a question. The question is, what if someone is under the salary threshold and is getting overtime, but with the overtime is over? Do you still have to continue to pay the overtime for the remainder of the year? The short answer is yes. To be exempt from overtime, you have to be paid on a salaried basis, which means that you get paid the same amount irrespective of the number of hours worked. If you work over 40 hours in a work week, or you work under 40 hours in a work week, your salary has to be at least $455 or whatever that new number will be prospectively. If you are paying overtime, it normally assumes that people are actually being paid based on the number of hours worked. There is an exception to that. There's something called you can give salaried workers who are exempt, meaning that they meet the duties tests and they're paid the minimum salary of $455 a work week. You can pay hourly premiums over and above that, but if you're paying those and you consider those workers exempt, you can add it or take it away pursuant to your policy anyway. So if they're getting overtime because you're paying them on an hourly basis and they're making them track their hours and you're docking their pay, if they're not, then they're not exempt anyway. The second question we got is whether there were unique regulations on workers in the government. Actually, the regulations are excluding coverage for the government workers. They haven't modified any of the regulations that pertain to government workers. and that question's a little vague. Some government workers are covered by the wage and hour protections and some are not, but those who are not covered are not being modified as a result of these changes. Okay, then the next question, this is a good question, what if you have outside sales who work on commissions but their salary is not at the new number regularly? So the outside sales exemption, so when they modified the regulations and they submitted the proposed regulations, they noted that the outside sales was being changed. However, under the outside sales exemption, you can pay their, you can meet the salary thresholds by commissions and salary, and that remains the same. So as long as the combination of of commissions plus base salary would be met, so prospectively that would be in that $50,000 range, then they could still be exempt. But under the new regulations, if that combination of commissions plus base pay doesn't meet the new number, then I think potentially we would have some classification issues. I do expect that we're going to get some feedback on the outside sales and whether there should be some further clarifications, but we don't have any yet in that regard. Again, if there are any questions that you'd like to ask privately, many of you I see on this list work with a variety of folks in our HR law group. In addition, my contact information is above or is included in the slides, and you can feel free to contact me. I appreciate everybody's time today, and I'll tell you that as soon as we have any further guidance, we'll take the same approach we did today. We will send you a brief update, and we'll schedule another webinar and let you know what's going on with any meaningful updates. Thank you, everybody, for your time, and this concludes our session.